And if you have services in general, what I always talk about is what you want to do is build an ecosystem around those services, okay? And I always talk about people should never be able to graduate out of your ecosystem. So if you're truly serving your client to the best of your ability, you'll understand that if they do graduate out of something you provide to them, they hit another level then. And what can you do to serve them at that level? And sometimes people are specialized in a level and that works great for them, and that's okay too. But for the most of us in this new business, era of professional services, this is how I built my business. I kind of started as design, and then I went into design and brand strategy.
What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Abundant Journey podcast. Thank you all for hanging out with us today. Hopefully you are watching on YouTube, as that is a new venture we have started. But if not, you're just listening to the podcast. We got an amazing guest lined up today. Torrey Dawley is hanging out with us today. But before we bring Torrey in, Nick, what's up, man? How are you?
Good. Just back off of the longest vacation I've ever taken, 16 days in British Columbia. Was incredible, but I was so glad to get back. I was 14 hours in the car, and most of my motivation for getting home was so that we could have this interview this morning. Torrey is one of my new favorite people. He and I connected a couple months ago. For those who might not be familiar with Torrey, Torrey's the founder of Sandpaper Studio. I said that right, didn't I? Sandpaper Studio. Okay, good. Sandpaper Studio, a design agency that has helped startups all the way to Fortune 500 companies since 2006. And in that time, Torrey's done a lot of innovative work in the agency space, and he's learned a lot of lessons from that he's now helping other people who are just starting in their entrepreneurial career or who have been spinning their wheels a little bit, just trying to figure out, okay, how do I keep my head above water? Torrey is absolutely the man to help out. So anyhow, that is a long-winded intro. Torrey, glad to have you on, man. How you been?
Great, man. Thanks, guys. I'm super stoked about this too. I'm glad you were willing to knock out a 14-hour drive to get back to this. I would have done the same. I've been excited for this too.
Dude, yeah, it was a little bit nuts. It's only supposed to be 8, but we'll save that a whole deal for another time. So, man, you're coming to us from Indianapolis, and that's where you've been for the past few decades, right?
Yeah. I grew up, I was born out actually in your neck of the woods near Seattle, and had a whole lot of family out there. And I grew up going back out there all the time and feel very connected to that space. But fundamentally, I grew up in Bloomington, Indiana, about an hour south of Indianapolis, moved here after going to college in northern Indiana, and set my roots here and just kept them here.
Right on. Yeah, I love it. One thing, and I've told you this before, but I think that Indy is one of the most underrated cities in the U.S. So I've been there a handful of times, absolutely loved it every time that I've gone. So even though you talk about your jealousy of being on the West Coast, there are things that I really love about the Midwest as well. I wanted to kick this interview off. It felt appropriate since you and I had connected on X, first and foremost. You had a tweet about a month ago where you said, "I can't unsee it. Every time I find an entrepreneur who works hard, provides good service, and exists within a market with lots of opportunity, but doesn't make $200,000 a year, I know exactly what their problem is and how to solve it." It's a sticky line. Now I'm curious, you didn't answer the question in the tweet. What's the problem, Torrey?
All right. So, how do I unpack that? I mean, right off the bat, it's a simple answer, but I don't want to be flippant about it because this happens to be the most difficult challenge that every founder faces, right? And even that 200 number I picked just simply because I wanted to relate to people a little bit more. That number would be a lot higher if I was really being completely transparent about it. They have a problem with their positioning straight up. I mean, they don't quite fully understand exactly who it is that they serve and why they're better or different than their competition in a manner that the ideal client actually understands, right? And we call that positioning. And it's very simple to break down. When you master what you do, who you do it for, and why it matters, that's the essence of positioning. And it sounds very simple, but we call this the difficult business problem for a reason. It's the single most difficult thing for founders to figure out how to do. And there's a number of reasons for them. We can maybe unpack that. But it's the testament to a game that we call business that has a 90% failure rate over time. Okay. And what I have found is That number is both sobering, and everybody interested in business should understand that number. But what I've also found is that number only applies to the people who are fundamentally doing things differently than the 10% who actually make it. And that's the essence of what I want to communicate when I give that message. It's not that it's hopeless and like, oh no, you have a 1 out of 10 chance of succeeding. It is, no, if you don't understand how to run business, you have a 1 in 10 chance of succeeding. And unfortunately, it's very easy to start a business. So that's why we see that number so high, right? What I have found is when people get their positioning right, when founders understand what it actually takes to run a business effectively, their success rate is way higher than 50%. You know, like it's a much different game. And that's what I want to help people understand, especially in the economy where solopreneurship is within reach of, virtually everyone with an internet connection, right? I want them to understand the fundamentals of what it takes to succeed in business, because as you know, I'm no friend or fan of the charlatan, approach out there that is trying to lead people off a cliff that frankly is, putting their entire life in their hands and then saying, no, go for it. You're fine. And they're not fine. You can't encourage, like I've always said, you can't talk somebody into entrepreneurship. That's the worst thing you can talk somebody into. They're either driven to do it or they're not. And if you talk them into it, you're just inviting them to pain, right? So that's a long way to answer that they have a problem with positioning, because it's never hard work. These people work their butts off and still fail, right? It's never the market opportunity, not never, but most often it's not the market opportunity. There's opportunity, right? And that's, again, it's just kind of dispelling some of those myths. If you work hard, if you build it, they don't necessarily come. That's not how it works. We have to understand how business works.
Yeah. No, that's a perfect answer. And part of why I wanted to kick off there is, one, to give you an opportunity to call out the charlatans, because I know how much you love
for that.
Yes. But I mean, one of the things that distinguishes you from so many of the folks that are just espousing pseudo wisdom online is that you've got 20 years of experience, that these realizations didn't just come to you in a vision one night, but these are hard-won facts from your own story. And so I would love to kind of turn back the clock now and start to just unpack, okay, what has the Torrey Dawley entrepreneurial journey looked like? And so, maybe we go back to kind of when you first had an inkling of, all right, I'm not going to do the typical W-2 path, 9 to 5 until I retire. I'm going to go out and start my own thing. Where did you first feel that impulse within you?
So I don't remember a time when I didn't. So I grew up, my dad owns a small construction company down in Bloomington. He and my brother build 3 to 4 houses a year, mostly custom homes. He went through a similar experience growing up where he had big teams and was kind of like a foreman and manager and never liked it. He's a craftsperson at heart and he loves to build homes for families, and he wants to be the person swinging the hammer. That was always his thing. And I grew up working on job sites, I can't remember when I wasn't like with a broom or like, carrying nail. I mean, we would be on roofs, keeping him stocked up with staples as he was roofing, you know what I mean? I was probably like 6, and I'm very grateful for that. And I didn't grow up in an environment where I knew what it was like to have a parent who had, a boss, like a manager, and so for me, that was something that I knew pretty early on that, I kind of understood that's the pathway that I wanted. And my original plan of going to the Navy to be a fighter pilot didn't work out when I found out I had a cataract in my right eye that I was born with, and there goes your perfect vision. So who knows what would have happened there? Thank God, actually. But so probably around the age of like 13, I was like, I know I want to run my own business at some point. I just had that feeling, I went to college for design. Okay, so I knew I had to go get, the schooling for design. I knew I had to start building that network and learn what I was doing there. I always had a passion for writing and for design. And I kind of just had clarity around that. I knew that's what I wanted to get into. So I went to school for that and I graduated out of that program with a job at an agency in Indianapolis. And so that really kicked off my career. And I also, even though I was driven to run my own business, I instinctively knew, that you can't be delusional. You're not going to go straight into doing this. Like I must learn the craft. I must build my network and I must kind of expand my mental real estate in this market. Okay. So I went straight into that agency job. Learned everything not to do at the first agency I'll just abbreviate that. I've talked about this before. And then I had an opportunity with a guy who was building his business from scratch. I literally started as a designer in his spare bedroom before we built out a studio and hired a small team. And he was just a massive blessing to me because he was not only in the I mean, you can't get in the trenches more than what he was dealing with. So I had front row seats to like, we're building this business, you know, basically from scratch, right? And he had high profile clients. Like he was very good, like very good. And he was also a brand strategist. And that was something that was really fascinating to me, but I hadn't been fully exposed to it. And man, we just dove into the deep end together. You know, we'd go to conferences, travel. We worked together very closely over the years. I would handle his clients. I mean, it was the best possible position I could have been in. And so it gave me like my introduction, not only to brand strategy and kind of kicked that whole side of me off, which was literally what funded my career from that point forward. But it also exposed me to networks and other people. And that was the thing. So I got involved in, it's called AIGA. It's the Professional Association for Design. So that's like one of those professional associations that people on Twitter have no idea exists, but drives most of the professional world, right? And I was at one point president of the local chapter here, involved with it for, I think, 6+ years. I was helping the national board on some big initiatives. I traveled all over the place, helped other chapters. So I just learned the power of networking and like expanding your mental real estate inside of a professional network. And that just opened up so much opportunity and a totally different way of seeing things for me, which again, I kind of carry forward now to Twitter as people are trying to figure out, you know, how do I find clients, how to expand my mental real estate? And they think that some algorithm is going to do it for them and are finding out the hard way that that's not how it works, right? So I'm trying to kind of help them understand how the professional world works too. Because who you know, I mean, you guys know this, who you know is everything, right?
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I kind of got all that exposure very, very early. I was very lucky in that regard, or I don't know. I don't really believe in the concept of luck. I shouldn't really say that. I was fortunate that I found the opportunities I did that could feed me in a way that my hunger kind of demanded, you know, and I just drove like crazy. So I worked with him for a while until, long story short, some kind of interpersonal issues that had nothing to do with him, you know, or me really, caused an issue in that company. And I decided I was going to take a different opportunity that kind of came my way out of nowhere that on the surface sounded very, very exciting. Some people I'd interned with started this whole new company with this like incredible, I have a wood shop. I build things. I love like designed objects. I'm a massive like mid-century, you know, modern furniture nut, you know, like I design and build my own. Okay. So like this opportunity came along and these folks were kind of trying to build a company that did a lot of those things. And it came right at the height of like peak friction in this other business. And so I thought I have to try, you know. Turns out I remembered why I didn't like working for those people when I was an intern and that things hadn't really changed. And that lasted exactly, I think, 45 days. Okay. And I was like, I've got to start my own thing. I'd learned enough by then, I knew. And I talk about this because, you know, I really encourage people these days to have a runway, you know, build your runway. And that's a physical, like monetary runway where you have, you know, 6 to 12 months of capital ideally, and that you also have your network and your opportunities in front of you as well. You can't just be a nobody showing up into a network from scratch. I mean, that's just not a good idea, right? And yet that is not what I did. I had one where I built on the network side. I definitely had that, but I had $3,000 in savings, which lasted about a month for me, right? And I was just like, I'm doing it. And I'm the kind of person that back against the wall fires up and can move. But I also recognize most people, that's not a good thing. The stress of the financial burden is not where you think most clearly and find the best opportunities, you know? So sometimes it's a little of like, do what I say, not what I do, you know, unless I really recognize that in somebody. But anyway, so I started that on nothing. And I took every single project I could find. I mean, like Mexican restaurant menus, you know, like little like editing copy jobs, anything that paid the bills. And
just real quick, about what year is this? Just to kind of give frame of reference in terms of where we're at, even technologically speaking.
You bet, man. 2006. This is before the iPhone was even on the market.
Yeah. So very different sort of landscape when it comes to finding clients, getting your work out in front of people. Okay.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Social media was not even, I mean, not really, you know, a thing. So it was, again, it's very much who you know, right? And what ended up, what happened is, you know, I was scraping and clawing and just paying the bills however I could, making it work. Unfortunately, I had a really extensive network and other designers and other companies who, you know, projects weren't a good fit for them or something, they would feed them my way. And that was really, you know, I'm still so grateful for all the people who helped me, you know, early on. And then I got a call from a marketing director who was a director at one of the companies that I served when I was working with the other guy I mentioned earlier. And she had left her company and gotten picked up by a company that just went public as their marketing director. And, you know, she's like, hey, I have a connection with you. You and I work together. I trust you. I'd love to bring you in to talk to the guys, meaning the CEO and COO of this company, worth about $500 million at the time, because they need to build their marketing. That's what they hired me to do. I want to bring you in. I'm like, 26 years old, like, let's rock, okay, cool.
Big step up from the Mexican menu.
A little bit different budgets and scopes,
Right.
And I don't need to go into some like long story about all of that, but sitting across the table from these two, rock star guys in their industry, at the age of 26 with a new marketing director, meaning like I'm starting literally from scratch. They don't even fully trust her yet, and that was very interesting. And that moment, I think it was literally that moment in that meeting that I did kind of earn their trust with my attitude and my approach, to what I was doing there, because they could have hired anybody, and they're still a client. Like they're still a client. So that's, awesome. And by the way, now they're the 5th largest in their entire industry in the world. They're pushing 10 billion market worth, capital. And I've basically built their brand, alongside them for that amount of time. So that's kind of that opened the doors.
Thinking back to that original interview, I mean, what do you think it was that really impressed them about you, your demeanor, how you carried yourself in that?
So you just have to ask this, don't you?
Have to.
So, okay, I've kind of always been who you see. Like, I don't really sugarcoat anything, as most people who follow me know on Twitter. There was a moment in the meeting where I could tell, and I had some intel from a person who was their previous marketing director, because I actually had just serendipitously worked with her at a different company. And I knew they had a sense of sort of antagonism towards marketing and design in general. They didn't really see the value in it, but they were being pressured by their advisors and now their investors to obviously take that seriously, right? And so I kind of knew that. And the CEO is very much, he's kind of like me, a little more fiery. And the COO is very composed. Like, they are a great team. They're a phenomenal team, because he is very much just kind of like stoic and, direct. And I could sense that dynamic immediately. And so I knew I had to play off of that dynamic while I'm sitting there. And I could also tell that my marketing director, I already had a feel for what she was really good at and what she wasn't. And one thing she wasn't very good at is kind of handling friction. She was better at like, oh, hey, we can move forward, when I have clear direction. But this friction started to pop up in some of the questions and the way she was answering them. And I was sensing that wasn't good. That wasn't the right way to go, right? And there was this kind of acute critical moment where she was talking about an approach to business cards. This is so long ago, everybody. Like, business cards I haven't had a business card in forever. And my business card was a designer's business card, letter pressed, blind embossed, like super, like, I mean, it was hot, but that's not for them. And she started trying to explain, it was as if she wanted to tell them, like, we need to be more creative like him. And I was like immediately I'm sitting here going like, what do I say? Like, what do I do? Like, no. Like they don't even have a functional, normal business card. Like, that's what we need. And this sounds so silly, but it was a sticking point for them. And they're looking at my card, and he turns to him at one moment and he goes, just imagine if we were doing business overseas, handing this to somebody, they wouldn't get it. And I jumped in that moment, and I had to kind of tiptoe along, like not making my marketing director look, I had to, mitigate anything she might have said, and also appeal to them in that moment. Cause I'm going, look, if this goes sideways, she's going to get fired. So we can't have that either. And I was, I just stopped immediately. And I said, guys, my industry is very different than your industry. The only thing that matters when it comes to these sort of touch points, like a business card, is this. And I said, there's no more impactful moment in all of business than shaking someone else's hand and handing them your business card when you look them in the eye. No more impactful moment. And if you don't leave the exact same impression with the materials you leave behind that you did when you were in person, you are setting yourselves back, like you're failing. And I said it just basically with that demeanor, like right in front of them. And they both kind of looked at each other and I directly kind of challenging them, like I had the guts to do that in that moment. And they said, that makes sense. That's the first time I think that's made sense. And I'm like, okay, thank God. Because and I'm not kidding. Like I have since learned, and it's so easy for me now to see it because it's been 20 plus years now of working with, they weren't my first exposure to top performers. Okay. I have kind of this obsession with top performers. I coach a lot of coaches who coach top performers. Sounds really weird to say that, but that's what I do. Because I understand their market. Okay, understand what top performers, how they think and how they operate. It is not how normal people operate. And I had exposure to them early in my career through that other gentleman that I was talking about, but also immediately there with them, those two. And one of the things you notice, especially in the corporate world, is so many of these people will build groups around them of effectively leeches. Okay, I'm just going to say it, like leeches and vampires who are trying to, leech off of their success, their opportunities, the wake that they're creating, right? And it's very much this sort of like me mentality across even SVPs and other directors. And they face this all the time. And what it ends up doing is it creates obviously trust issues, amongst the leadership and these top performer types, but it isolates them, makes them feel a little bit alone. It makes them also feel like they're not quite sure if they can trust the data they're getting from those people because they have a secondary motive, which is to be, to appeal to the leader, right? To be their buddy and to get the high fives versus necessarily telling them what's really going on in the truth. And that was the very first opportunity I had to kind of look them in the eye and say, like, we're not BSing here. Like, this is legit. Like, you need to understand this. Like, you're big boys now. You just went public. You need to start taking marketing seriously. And nobody had the guts to say that. You know what I mean? And I think maybe, again, some of their advisors might have had that, but nobody functionally in their, team had that. And I've had that attitude ever since. I've gotten calls at, I don't know if I should say this publicly. I guess it's okay. I've gotten calls from, let's just say, leadership in that company at 7 p.m. at night on multiple occasions saying, hey, you understand us, you know us, I need help understanding this dynamic. I'm like, okay, cool. Yeah. I remember one day specifically dripping with sweat from a workout at the moment. And here my phone rings. I'm like, oh my God, and I answer, I'm like, hey, and he's like, hey, we had this great conversation, but that's the kind of trust you earn when you understand their needs and they have an advisor that they can see, understands them from an outside perspective. And I've just always taken that attitude. I've always leaned in and owned that attitude. I'm like, I'm not going to sugarcoat and pal around things. It doesn't serve them. It doesn't serve me. And I've always had that attitude with my clients too. It's something that I take very seriously. Like when it comes to marketing and brand strategy, you can say anything that sounds good. And most people do. And my simple question to people is always, is that true? Like I've literally stopped marketing director meetings in these rooms, in these conference rooms in corporate world where everything sounded good and everybody's happy. And I literally asked that question, hey, is that actually true? And they all look at each other like, well, we didn't consider that. Maybe we should consider that, and I live in a world that's very much, if it sounds good, do it. And that's something that I've always kind of held, and again, I hope that comes across to people in my content where it's like, I think we should probably fixate a little bit more on reality. But I guess I learned that kind of the hard way growing up in all these high intense, corporate environments.
Totally. And I love that. I want to camp for a minute on the givers and takers concept, because what I've heard through the story and the underlying theme here is relationships are essential. And a lot of times I think we lean in and say, what can I get? You're talking about the leeches. How can this benefit me? Has your journey, when you were walking in the room, meeting the mentors, getting exposure to these kind of people, were you looking for, how can I provide value? What can I do for these people? How do you navigate that? What advice would you give to somebody, especially who's saying, how do I just want a mentor. I want to find somebody who I can learn from.
Yeah, I think to answer the question directly, I just always keep a subconscious sort of attitude towards, hey, what does this person need? And I do that even in my daily conversations. I mean, all the time. I'm really, it really, it humbles me, but it excites me too when I hear back from people like, man, when you talk to him, he's just dialed in. Like his whole world condenses to you in that moment, and I'm like, oh, that's cool, to hear that, because that is how I feel about people. It's like, what do you need? What do you need in this moment from me? Because that's the thing that I want to be able to do whatever I can to help somebody get to that next level, see something more clearly, unpack a problem that they've been facing, or understand what their next best step is, and I'm kind of obsessed over that concept of what's your next best step. So I think about that a lot. And I really truly, and again, I don't know if this is like learned or innate or whatever. I don't know. I don't really think about, well, what can they do for me? Like, I don't really think about that. I only think of, do they align well with what I can help them solve? Like, do they actually have the problems I can solve, right? Like, I'm not going to pretend to help somebody that I can't actually help. So it is about them. I don't want to derail it. I mean, I read Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People when I was very young. And I think there's some subconscious, seeding in there that stuck with me. And I've reread that book multiple times. But I've never found a better book in terms of how to like understand how to interact with other people. And, just listening to them. Like, this is an odd format for me because on a podcast, you have to talk, more about things. But like when it comes to people, like, just listen and they'll tell you what they need. And I think just that alone is so rare, and, I don't know. I can think of times where maybe that's kind of gotten me in trouble a little bit where, I've like overextended myself or something. But at the end of the day, I go about it as, hey, what do people need? And that means I have to be really good, that I have to be really good at what I do. And then later I learned what that also means is I need to bring in other people who are good at the things I'm not good at, because my clients' needs started to get more complex, right? And they didn't just need what I did. They need photographers and videographers and, copywriters and, PR and all that stuff. So I had to build those teams around, which kind of led to my hub model idea, right? All through the lens of like, how do I help? How do I help solve your problems to get you to that next best step? There was a second layer to your question that I feel like I didn't really address there if it didn't stick.
No, I thought that was great. I think just ultimately with relationship being the backbone, and so many times folks just they're that leech mentality. What can I get out of it? But it sounds like just by leading with how can I help you? How can I solve your problems? That alone has gotten you in the room with and given you incredible opportunities.
Yeah, it really has. I'm trying to, I just got kind of in my mind of thinking about all the times where I could have said like, oh, I can do that, where I didn't, where I'm like, I know somebody who can help you better. Like I actually have a better resource for you. And what's really interesting is so many of those people, they just keep coming back to you because you're the person who helped them find that other person. I have so many clients who over the years I've said, hey, the timing's not right, or this other person could do better, who came back to me years later with a challenge that actually fit my wheelhouse better, or maybe I was in a better spot. The taker mentality is, there's no better way to put the scarlet letter on your forehead or something, and then like interactions, like coming in going, what can I take from all of you is gotta be like, people think that they can hide it or spin it or turn it around. It's just, you're literally repelling everybody from you. I'm trying not to turn up the dial. I really hate that feel. I hate that a lot. Cause for me, like, it's so transactional. And I think back to your point, the relationship concept, like for me, it's always been relationships. When I first came over to Twitter, one of the hardest things for me, and we can talk about my transition from like no social media whatsoever to actually jumping on over there, but I could not believe the just extraction mentality, the transactional, like I'm going to get the $59 out of you or $12,000 out of you or whatever they're pitching. And then I don't really care after that. I want your testimony. I want your money. And then I get out of here. Right. Like there was never this, like, what is with the relationships? Like my average in Sandpaper Studio, and I have to actually revamp this because the last time I checked was last year, at the time was 11.2 years average relationship from my clients.
Incredible.
Yeah.
So how that compares to like a typical agency client relationship?
Yeah, it's roughly about 18 months in my industry.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure you're about 10x what the typical is. That's incredible.
It's wild. And that tells me so much because this is a hyper competitive industry where people are pitching all the time. I have so many industry friends in the agencies, in the places that are pitching my clients all the time, who still consistently reach out to me and be like, how are you keeping them? Like we've been hitting them for a year now with our best offers, basically offering to do things for free, and they still won't leave you. It's like, this is, again, it's like, I say all of that because I think people underestimate just the value of what a relationship is actually worth in real life. I think they really do. I don't think they understand that that's the real currency is your relationships and your ability. If you are trusted by people, they will come to you, right? And the higher value people who trust you, the more value you'll have brought to you. And that is, to me, just like that. I can't think of a more important currency in life. I just can't.
Yeah, that's so interesting, the connection there between trust and just who you are. I think that you could have the tagline as the most honest man on X. I was in pastoral ministry for 6 years. We had a guy on the team that we called the no bullshit pastor, and he was everybody's favorite guy. And as I think about, the personas on X, it's like, yeah, that's who Torrey is. Like you're going to get who he is. You're going to get his honest thoughts, but they're going to be sincere. Like, he's not trying to rip you down or knock you down. He's actually trying to help you. And I think that that's a really rare trait to find, but extremely important when it comes to relationship building. But to kind of get back onto your story, I mean, so 06, you're starting Sandpaper Studio. You sign your first major client, incredible opportunity there at 26 years old. And then 20 years of just smooth sailing, right?
Totally,
just one
man.
big
Parties.
client after. Yeah.
Every day, parties in my mansion.
Congratulations.
I know.
Incredible.
I don't know what else to say.
Cracked the code.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you. I mean, thank you for sharing that about how I guess you see things, because honesty is sometimes, like, I feel like protector, kicks in, but then you got to be careful too. I was joking about this on my call yesterday with my coaching group students who are in my program, and one of my favorite, they're all my favorite. My God, they're so amazing people. But like, she has a way with words, and so she goes, but sometimes you can be a little scary with certain. I was like, what? Scary? I'm like, I have like a lovable fuzzball of energy. Like, what do you mean scary? I'm like, you're in my tribe. Like, if I'm scary, that's good. I'm scary to them, not you. What is happening? So I was teasing them, and they were all we were talking about that dynamic. But yeah, it's whatever. I have to manage that. But yeah, so I started off. I came out of the gate, and I went from, again, $500 projects that I could find anywhere. And then in a matter of maybe 6 months, something like that, of working with the bigger client. And of course, once you sign a big client like that, the other big clients start to notice in your network, right? So I started picking up a couple others too. And I remember acutely sitting on something like 38 grand in reserves is what I had. And so you're sitting here going like, holy cow, you went from literally debt and like nightmare material to, oh, there's 38 grand. And I started feeling the pressure a little bit from not the clients themselves, but the people at the companies that I was helping, of like, can he handle the workload? Don't we need an agency? This kind of thing. And at that moment, I was taking business classes and business courses with, cohort groups and investing in myself and all that stuff. Right. And I had a little bit of this, like, okay, I got to grow. Everybody around me was all like, traditional entrepreneur, approach, right? Like, you build the business, you scale, you got to remove yourself from operations, you work on the business, not in the business. All those themes were just constant to me, right? And so I'm like, okay, let's do this. And as a younger designer too, there was this appeal to, man, you could build out, like, I had a small studio downtown Indy, and you dream of kind of like, oh, you could own this cool old building with brick walls and, the glass like divider panels and ping pong tables and crap, and like designers making really hot, work and all that. And I'm like, that's cool. So I was kind of into that too. I thought, at the time, like, that'd be kind of fun to lead a team like that. And I love leading people, so I started to do that. I started going down the very traditional, like, E-Myth, book path, right? Of like, oh, I'm going to find people to replace me as the laborer, right? As the tactician or the technician, I think is the actual term in the book, which is very good. I'm going to find new technicians. I'm going to find, new designers and bring them in. And just like everybody else who does that the first time and has no idea what the hell they're doing, you find out like, oh, now I'm a manager. And now I just triple my, bottom line. And now I've got to go find a bunch more work. So I'm a manager and a sales guy now. You know what I mean? When all I wanted to do is be like a really hot designer and make awesome work. And it separated me from the clients and the work. And this is later in retrospect, I realized like, this is exactly what my dad always felt when, it was like, you got to be the foreman telling everybody else how to do it, when what he really wanted to do is have, sawdust all over him. That's what he really wanted, and I'm the same way. I mean, I'm like, the nut doesn't fall far from the tree, right? So like, that's definitely what I found out, but I found out the hard way. I had two customers two employees, both designers at one point, and I just couldn't guide them. I just couldn't give them what they needed. And they weren't either of them a very good fit for the model that ultimately I even could have built, even if I had been building it, which I wasn't. So it just didn't work. And, I still remember, especially having to let go of the first hire that I made. He's just one of the most beautiful humans I've ever met. Just such a wonderful guy, and that I still rank that in one of the like top 3 most painful moments of my life. It sucked. And to have to go through that, and now watching him, thrive in his own and all, that's really cool. But it was just, it sucked. And that left me with this like I don't want anything to do with that again, that this is terrible. And knowing that a large part of it, it's so easy. All these people around me in the business are like, they're not a right fit, cut them, let them go. And I'm like, how do you freaking look at people like that? Like, I didn't build the environment that he needed. I hired him into an environment he wasn't right for. Like, that's me, like, what the hell? And I hated it. I hated it. I hated everything about those years. And also my balance sheet hated it. So I went from, walking into the 38,000 plus or whatever in surplus and okay, let's keep clicking, to the dumbest thing you can possibly do in business, which is, keep doubling down on things that effectively don't work until you max out your lines of credit and your credit cards and basically run out of steam entirely. And I have a remarkable pain tolerance, which is a gift and a curse at the same time. And unfortunately, when stupidity of youth mixes with pain tolerance, that's not generally a good recipe in business. So I found that out the hard way. And right around 2009, 2010, there's also all kinds of like personal stuff. I was going through a divorce at the time. There's just like, it's rock bottom, man. I mean, and I kind of have a feeling, I'm a little bit kind of like the old Chuck Palahniuk and Fight Club narrative of like, you kind of have to get to rock bottom. You have to find that in your life. I think sometimes as a young man, especially. Well, I found it. And I just knew I had to change something like that. This doesn't work. Like this business model, I don't want the empire. There's no way. I don't want to be the manager. I don't want to be the big boss. I don't want to be the person that's detached from the work. I hate all of that. I want to have my hands in what I do, but I want to also find a way to build leverage around that. I know I can't just do that forever without hitting a ceiling really quickly. And that was the kind of subconscious war going on in my mind at the time that now I can articulate clearly. But like back then, that was the thing. And what emerged out of that was literally hitting a night where I thought I was just going to, I had two acute episodes, I remember. One was December 14th. And it's funny how this remembers, and it was probably about 3 a.m. And I'm just literally debating in my head, do I get up and go puke or do I try to fall asleep? Like I've been doing this for 3 hours, trying to figure it out because I was out. I was out of money and I had payments coming that I had to make. And there's no way you can't make them now. There's no way there's no Peter to rob to pay Paul anymore. Like it's over, right? And I literally am wrestling if I call my buddy, one of my best friends who at the time was a bankruptcy attorney, right? So there's some fortuitousness for you. And I'm sitting there going, am I calling him tomorrow? Like I got to get his advice. I hadn't admitted this to anybody either, by the way. Nobody knew what I was dealing with really, not even the person I was married to at the time. And, I ultimately did not get up and puke. I probably should have, it probably would have helped. But, that next day, I remember I got an email from a client who said, hey, that project campaign that we're working on, I'm going to go ahead and pay the other 2 installments up front because they want to get it on this year's billing instead of next year's. And I'm like, okay, literally the next day. And that saved that literally saved everything right there in that moment. But I wasn't out of the woods, I had to make the decisions. And in that first moment, it changed. I knew right then, like you're out, bro, like you're out of rope. Right. And I had to change. So I had to face that, like, okay, I've got to make these hard decisions and figure this out. And then several months later of trying to figure that out and going through all the things to kind of right the ship and get everything kind of even back out again, it was still so stressful because I hadn't figured out my other model yet. I didn't know what I was going to do. I knew how to kind of rescue what I was doing to enough degree to survive, but I didn't know what I could do to get away from this nightmare. And I remember crossing the street, the studio that I was in, that you cross the street like diagonally across 2 roads at a time, right on a little intersection. And I don't know if this was God or who telling me something, but it felt like that. I stopped in the middle of this intersection and I had this overwhelming feeling as I was walking to my truck on the parking on the other side of like, you've got to give this up. Like, stop doing this to yourself. Like, give it up, let it go. That's how it felt. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of like peace inside of me. Like, you're right. Like, I can just let this go. Like, not the business, but my idea, the conceptualization of what I needed to build and how it needed to be built. And all these other people telling me, you got to scale. You don't have a real business if you don't have a team. All this nuts stuff that people are trying to tell me that sounds good on the surface, but doesn't actually serve the owner. It's like, let it all go. Forget it. Figure out what you need to figure out, what you want, and go do that. like this all hit me, and none of this was articulated. I just felt it all. And I literally stopped in the middle of the road. That's why I remember this. I don't remember the date, but I do remember stopping. And that was the moment that hit me into, okay, I'm going to design what I want and work through this. And ultimately what I figured out was, and this sounds, again, in retrospect, is so hilarious. And I do want people to understand this, because with founders, we struggle with a lot. And people, again, we play a game that 8% of the population plays. Okay, that's how many entrepreneurs, the percentage in the US at least. Okay, roughly 8 to 9% of people even attempt to take on business and run it at any given time. And once again, of that, statistically, 90% of them fail over time, right? So if you're a successful business owner that's actually making it work, you're literally in the roughly 2 percentile of the entire freaking population, right? Meaning 98% of people have no idea what you're experiencing or dealing with, okay? And so I'm sitting there, so it sounds in retrospect like this was so stupid of me, given that I've got my dad's business and his model and how he had grown up. I've already faced all the pain and everything. What I ultimately arrived at was I could build my business the way my dad built his business, where the contractors do this all the time. Like, they're the contractor. They could build the house from scratch if they wanted to. They know how to do all of it. But if they need to hire out plumbing or electrical or drywall or painting or roofing, they can do it. You just build the team around you to do that. And they're not your employees. You just bring them in as contractors to help you get that done. And it's like, that should have been, and again, this is literally 2009, 2010, like in that transition period. So it's not like this was a normal thing. The internet still wasn't even like a viable option for launching businesses, and I'm sitting here thinking like, why don't I just do that? Like, I've done that in the past. I've had people come in and fill in when I needed my friend who is an illustrator or my friend who's a photographer, and I loved it. It was awesome. Like, they were better than me. They got it done. They were self-driven. I didn't have to fight about any of it. I didn't have to go back in and review. I didn't have all the struggles that I had with like my employees, And on top of that, I didn't have to pay their payroll taxes. I could just scope it, get it done, and then go, right? And they didn't have to like come back to me being like, I need more work or my family starves, Like, it was so much easier. And then the second, like, that was like an epiphany for me. And the second epiphany was like, holy crap, like, I have this customer over here, this big customer in retail real estate development, again, one of the top REITs who they build shopping centers and malls and mixed use centers and like experiential centers on the ground, right? And I have this other one over here who's Firestone, literally, right? Like, and then I've got another one over here that's a medical, community. And I'm like, none of them need the same team members. All three of these people have very disparate needs. And that's like when this clicked, and I started thinking about all the other agencies in my town who were getting the work and were trying to compete, against me. And I'm like, they all have one team. They have these fixed teams. And I freaking know that team member that they have has his specialty and is not good at the other client's work that they're serving right now. They're not giving their client the best work. I can, because I can go hire the best illustrator for that style. And I can go hire the best photographer for their style. And I can bring these teams together and mix and match and basically build super groups around the needs of the client and serve them best. And I was just like, I'm not going to cuss on this show as much as I can help it, but I was like, oh my God, like, it was a huge epiphany, right? And I was just like, it was like, I'm going to do that. And then that clarity became my challenge, is now I have to sell that. And that's where you still see some of that language if somebody goes and researches even how I describe, my company on Sandpaper Studio side, which I've literally never done formal marketing or sales for ever. It's always been word of mouth and by design, and that's how I want it to. But I am the anti-agency. I directly go after the people who are underserving the companies with the bigger budgets, with their, dog and pony shows where they literally waste half of their budget just chucking their work to their C teams, when I'm over here custom building teams for them that solve exactly their problem for literally higher quality and less budget, right? And that's hard to do. That's really hard to do in business. And that's what I kind of leaned into and got a little mouthy about, because I found out that's what most people wanted. 80% of my marketing directors did not want to work with agencies. They just felt like they had to, because somebody like me didn't show up. And that's what I try to help people now understand, is that the economy is driven by the people who care the most, or who get in front of the people before the people who care the most, right? So if you really do care the most, you'll do whatever you have to do to get in front of those people and make sure they get served. And that, to me, is helping people serve needs. That's being useful to the world.
Huge pivot, and really like kind of the launch of your experimenting with solopreneurship. Not that was even a term at that point, right? But really building a business around you and then around the network that you've built, and really being able to pull in both the top quality people and people that you enjoy working with, and probably giving them more creative autonomy as well, because they're running their own businesses simultaneously. So really cool model to start building. Certainly something that has taken off over the past decade or more, and you've been a part of that. So I want to talk some about just the opportunity that folks have in solopreneurship. I also want to talk about how solopreneurship plays into lifestyle design, because I know that freedom is a really important aspect for you, and something that most founders of businesses find that they become a prisoner to their own business. And that was something that you were feeling at that critical moment in your own life. And through the shifts, pivots you made, sounds like you found the escape key and no longer are living in a prison of your own making. And so, talk to me just about solopreneurship, living a life of freedom, designing a business that fits your lifestyle.
Yeah. So it took 2.5 to 3 years for me to climb out of that hole, for the record. So anybody who, I don't want to create the impression that I flipped a switch and suddenly I was good to go, right? Like I had built I know, right? The party mansion didn't come for years later. In fact, I got to design it. But anyway, it took a long time to crawl out of the hole that I had built, and it took me a long time to figure it out too, right? Like it was tough, but yes, now that model is alive and well, and to the degree that it's been in some ways hijacked and mischaracterized. So now we're facing the opposite problem, which is pulling the reins back in on, hey, what does this really mean? I think one of my most common tweet topics that I've used and has gotten a lot of notoriety is a very simple phrase that I use, where you can build your own prison faster than you can build your own business, right? And that is something that, when it comes to solopreneurship, like that's legit, right? Like it's very easy to understand. Like you max out on time. Like it's very easy to understand. Well, it's just you. So if you're the one doing all the service work and the labor, just do the math, right? If you don't want to work 80 hours a week, then you're going to cap your, income too. And now you've got this interplay. There's no leverage, right? That's the idea. What I discovered was that gets thrown around towards people who want to stay small and stay lean. Like there's a lot of people out there, and these are mostly people who either haven't run businesses, at all, or haven't stood the test of time in business yet, and are still very much in that early growth phase, like I was in way back in the day, where I thought I knew what the hell I was doing and I had no clue whatsoever. So keep that in mind, that these are the people who are the loudest, who will scream at you and say, you don't have a real business and this isn't actually, profitable, and you're maxing out and you have no leverage and all that nonsense, right? And what I found was, one of the gifts that I've been kind of given in my career, in addition to having my own business experience directly, I have worked with hundreds of business leaders, like hundreds of them. If I added all the tangential people I've just helped who have reached out to me for help, I bet it's over 1,000, right? But I've literally worked with hundreds in terms of like clients or, some sort of coaching or consulting or whatever, right? And I get a very unique peek under the hood, right? So one of the things that you'll find about business owners, and I deal with this a lot, especially I talked earlier about top performers, they're the pinnacle of this. But every business owner suffers this. They understand intrinsically and correctly that if they project weakness at all, they become undesirable in their market. Okay, so business owners are notorious for hiding any sense of weakness whatsoever, because they don't want to appear as if they're not, worth hiring or desirable, right? And that's something that becomes very lonely when you don't understand how to have that conversation somewhere else to go, hey, here's what I'm really experiencing. And one of the most common threads I notice among all business owners is this feeling of being on an island. And I'm looking around at all of them and I'm going, you're all suffering from the same thing. I've talked to all of you. All of you are struggling with the same problems, but none of you want to talk about it, because if you open up about that and admit your weaknesses and what you're dealing with, then it's a negative projection, and they don't want to do that. That's a recipe for disaster. And so I'm here to tell people right now, of all, again, 2% of the population, that's all who tries this. The vast majority of them have built something that feels a whole lot different than what they thought their business was going to be. Okay. And they're prisoners to it in some respect. And I face that most acutely with my employees. I felt like a prisoner to employees. That was a nightmare. And again, if anybody out there is a founder right now, is going down the list of what did you think your business was going to give you? How did you think that lifestyle was going to look compared to how it looks today? again, most of them are probably feeling like, yeah, I have a lot more freaking strings attached to me than I really thought I would. And a lot of them will either try to cope with like almost like a retirement mindset, right? So people who hate their job, but they're like, oh, but I have this retirement horizon. And once I reach retirement, oh, baby, it's the Fidelity commercial with the sailboats, right? Like life's going to be great, right? And that's this idea. And so some of them in their business will go like, well, there's going to be some M&A thing somewhere, I'll get somebody to buy me out, or I'll be able to, get away from this and escape with equity. And when you look at the stats of that, it's very clear that once again, like when you see who sells their business at all, okay, so all business owners who actually ends up selling is roughly, the last data I've looked, somewhere between 50 to 60% end up actually selling at all. And when you start to unpack what that means, though, when you start looking in to the polls and the numbers and how people report their satisfaction with that buyout moment or those M&A moments, that number of the people who did that falls to somewhere around 30 to 40% who actually describe it as, well, my buyout conditions were what I wanted. So what that means when you do the math on this is somewhere around, 10, 20%, let's just be gracious, of business owners ever actually exit their business in a way that makes them happy, right? And there's a whole host of reasons for why, right? But that's the math that we're up against. So when we're sold this idea of like, you have to work on the business, not in the business, so that you can build up and sell, and you watch all these like VC funded, Silicon Valley stories of like acquisitions from Google and everybody escapes with buildings, like they're forgetting a couple key factors. And one is the math on that. And then the second is that is a storyline that is literally built upon people whose entire mindset was like entrepreneur with a capital E. And I think that's different than entrepreneurs with a lowercase e. I think most people who start businesses are entrepreneurs with a lowercase e. And I think that's great. Entrepreneurs with a capital E, to me, those are people whose craft, when we talk about our craft, like I'm a designer, I'm a brand strategist, I'm a coach, right? We all have our craft, right? Their craft, the capital E entrepreneur, is building businesses and selling them. That's what they do. That's a capital E entrepreneur. So they don't care if it's a moving business. They don't care if it's a power washing business. They don't care. All they want is to pick that business up, make it as best as humanly possible, as value as possible, so that when they sell it, they make the most that they can. That's an entrepreneur with a capital E. That's their craft, building and selling businesses. When you ask most business owners if they even intend to sell their business, most of them have no answer for you, or it's a no. Even if they say they want to, they have no idea what the conditions of that might look like. And again, I can strip out the numbers of where like a family member or, a son or daughter, whoever takes over the business. When you start stripping all those away, you see the cold, hard reality of what it actually looks like to sell a business. Okay. So people have to get very clear on whether or not they actually want to do that, because what ends up happening is, well, I'm putting in all this effort and all this time, all this sacrifice for that horizon line with the pot of gold. When I sell and make the money, and oh, oopsies, it didn't come. And now they look back and they're 60 and they've got no skills. They haven't kept up with the market. Their business isn't really worth what they thought. And it's a nightmare, right? And that's, again, this is a common theme. This is a common problem. I reject all of that. I hate all of that. I think you should build a business. If you're going to operate that business, if you're not an entrepreneur with a capital E, if you're going to operate inside that business some way or another, which, by the way, my billionaire friend that I'm just talking about, that I sat across the table from, in that first meeting, is still glued to his business every single day. Yes, he's got a private jet and multiple homes and all these things. My quality of life is better than his. Straight up. And that's the thing that I want to remind people. But that doesn't mean, oh, I'm an entrepreneur, so suddenly I have a great lifestyle. I know tons of, a solopreneur. Like I know tons of solopreneurs who are miserable and not making it and are struggling for opposite reasons. So I really don't get into this like the game of competing over what's a real business or what isn't a real business. Like I make a joke about this on Twitter. Like anybody who posts, "You don't have a real business," followed by anything, I just insta block them. I'm like, I'm out. Like if you're over there going like telling people they don't have real businesses, I'm like, I'm out. Like I just can't do it anymore, And I'm a little bit joking about that, but at the same time, it's kind of like I'm to that point where don't tell people what is and isn't a real freaking business. I don't want to hear it. Are you or are you not providing value in a way that gives you a lifestyle that you enjoy living? And can you or can you not build any leverage off of that? Those are the questions that I'm asking in the modern era. I'm not interested in having a 1997 business model conversation. So when it comes to, solopreneurs, for me, what they do have to understand is that this is a different game. This is a dynamic game. You will hit a ceiling. You will be limited by certain perceptions, right? You will have strengths and you will have negatives. You better understand how the game works, right? And my approach was always, and again, I call it the hub model. That's just what I coined way back in the day, right? There was no like, whatever, like distributed teams or any of these other terms that, fractional, CMOs that you hire, none of that stuff existed back then. I just call it the hub model. I'm the center of the hub, and I tack on whoever I want to build the team, right? And we draw a circle around that, all those circles, and that's our team for that project. And that's the way I still look at it right now. And that game is played very, very differently than hiring a bunch of W-2 employees and putting them all in one box.
What, Torrey, as you're talking here, it seems like we're kind of contrasting the solopreneur, the business owner and entrepreneur. And then we really started the episode with the W-2 person and somebody who doesn't have any business jumping into this, but maybe has been allured by, the potential or the promises. So as I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about our audience, what are some cues or things they should listen to inwardly? Because you have your journey and your experience, but you also have spent so much time with all of these different categories. What are some things people should be listening for within to maybe draw them toward one of those paths?
And that's a really good question, because I think about a couple different things. Where my head went first to that question was, if you feel like you have a burning desire that tells you I can do this better than these other people. Like, I know I can help my client better than this, right? Like, I know I can do a better job. That there's something about that I think is really important to listen to, right? And not in a delusional sense, but I mean, like, you actually do know, like, the people I want to help are not being helped. They're not being served. So I would almost feel a responsibility or a compulsion to build something that actually does serve them better. And we've never lived in a better era for the ability for us to connect directly with those people and help them. So we'd have to figure out, if they're just starting out, we'd have to figure out, okay, well, what's the smallest step that I can take in order to get exposure and into those networks and make sure those people are aware of me, and also know how I can actually help them. And I'll use design as an example, just because that's very easy for the conversation. Like, you don't necessarily have to go to somebody. If you're still a designer at an agency somewhere or something, right? And you're like, I want to start my own design agency business. They're very comfortable with the idea of freelancing. Everybody knows the freelancing idea, right? You don't go to them and pitch their entire campaign and want to become their agency on record, and get their $500,000 budget. You just ask them about their problems, talk to them about their problems. They're going to tell you at some point about something that their agency's not doing well, or the need that they're not getting, solved. That's your opportunity to go, hey, I could take care of that for you. I'd love to take care of that for you. Or if you have a skill set that that they need, you can talk to them and say, hey, I think I could help you here. Let's come up with something that's just easy for you to say yes, right? And get your foot in the door and find out. And in exchange for that, we talked about this before we started recording. In exchange for that, lower budget, lower price point, lower like risk for them, you're getting the ability to prove yourself to somebody who's legit in a way that also helps you craft, did I actually solve their problem? Because you're just going out on a limb assuming you do. You can, right? But you need to find that out. And so you have to find the right balance to that. You don't want to talk to somebody who would abuse that, obviously. There are people who would abuse that. But at the same time, you got to start somewhere and find those opportunities, and maybe start with the smaller companies who don't have access to a $500,000 budget. They have a $20,000 budget. And you're like, hey, I can help you because look, I'm an A or B player at a freaking agency, right? Like, you normally couldn't afford us, right? But you can afford me as a freelancer, right? And virtually every industry has some form of that, right? I mean, as long as you don't have non-compete NDAs, whatever, but those are all dying. So I think that's just like, start small and get there. That's one compulsion I think is that would drive people's, I can do better. I can help them. And another compulsion is obviously just the desire for more control and freedom and time and, effort. And that's the thing that people have to understand, is like their desire for more freedom, their desire for more time. And then they go start a business. I'm like, really? You wanted more freedom and time and you decided to start a business. Well, that's cool. Again, just because
20 steps backwards before you get one step forward in that.
There's that, it's like a meme at this point, but what is it? Something like entrepreneurship is doing in 80 hours what you used to do in 40 hours for less money, but convincing yourself you're free or something like that, and it's like, look,
I know,
right? And there's truth to that. There is truth to that. But the unfortunate thing that people forget, especially in professional services, is your clients end up becoming a form of boss. And they end up sort of directing you and telling you, because they're paying you money now. And if you've never experienced that dynamic before, you find out real quick, like, oh crap, I just traded one boss for 8. And so there's an art to it. You have to be able to position yourself accordingly so that you're not the person that's just an order taker like you used to be as a W-2 employee, right? Like, you have to establish yourself in your client's mind as somebody that they need to listen to as well. And that takes time, takes effort. I get it. But that compulsion to be free, people need to follow that. They need to pay attention to that, but they have to understand that requires playing a game. And that game requires understanding the rules of that game in order to win that game. And that's the thing that I'm really trying to help people understand when it comes to small business and solo business, that in order to play that game and actually win, you have got to figure out how to ultimately find forms of leverage still. To me, it was not different than building another business. Like a true solopreneur who's like no one else. It's just me, right? I mean, I've seen it happen. I've talked about my own experience. I don't need to talk exact numbers, but I'm quite happy with the amount of money that I made over my career, right? And 90% of the work, the dollars that were billed in my company were me, literally me sitting there, right? And so I'm very much a solopreneur in that sense, you know what I mean? A lot of times, so I'm never going to tell somebody they can't do it, especially if you have an internet connection and can work from wherever. But at the end of the day, you will hit a time frame where, again, what's best serving your customer, your client, is to make sure that it is not just you. Because you are going to want to take a vacation someday. You are going to want to not work 80 hours someday. You are going to have a need that you can help them with, but you're not the best person. But your friend who owns, the other agency or, a solopreneur does. So I want to bring them on. And that's how you start to build leverage. And that's where I've kind of found myself now with Sandpaper Studio. I'm very much up here now in the like art direction and overall like strategic work. And then the rest of my teams are built under me to do the work, and that keeps me just like away from the day-to-day grind of it all. And of course, I've pivoted largely away from all of that still. But I don't know if that's the compulsion for freedom and more time is very real, and it's you should honor that and look for that. But you better understand that like that also takes a ton of work to get done. It's kind of like I want a house, and it's like, okay, cool, you got to build your house. Like, oh wait, I have to build it. Like I just wanted to go over and hit the AC and turn it down to feel more comfortable or whatever. It's like, yeah, cool, but you have to build it first to get there.
A lot of steps,
like you said, 20 of them at least, right?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to pick up on a couple of things there, just in terms of leverage, positioning, even as that relates to the pivots now that you've made. You've certainly hit a degree of stability with Sandpaper Studio. You've got other passions now, a lot of which we've kind of hinted at here in terms of your coaching, being able to help other entrepreneurs, solopreneurs. And it is interesting just with positioning and leverage. You talk a lot about finding your ideal client, especially in solopreneurship, because there is a ceiling on how much time you have. It seems like your point of leverage is not time, but finding the highest value clients, finding the right fit for you. And so you can take this whichever direction you want to go, whether that's that you want to talk about just positioning ideal client, or if you want to talk about what you're doing in terms of coaching and your new perfect positioning program. But I'd just love to hear kind of why that's become such a passion for you, and how you can help solopreneurs, entrepreneurs leverage their time, leverage themselves better.
Yeah. I'll try to unpack that the best that I can. It's really kind of a culmination, I guess, of everything in my career, so being a brand strategist and designer and working with marketing teams at the highest levels, teaches you a lot about what it takes to effectively communicate with your ideal clients, right? And then also being somebody who's built products and helped teams, like I've actually helped them build and develop and design products as a designer, like product, meaning like service lines and things like that. So again, I've kind of have, I guess, a unique perspective on what that looks like. But the biggest problem that everybody faces, like if you talk to every business owner, like if you just poll them and ask them, and there are polls and data on this, if you ask them, what is your primary concern, right? Like it's normally asked with, what's the primary reason that businesses fail, right? And the number one reason is cash flow, right? Always. They run out of cash. And it seems obvious, right? Because that's because a business can't survive without cash. So it's obvious, right? But the question is why? Why'd they run out of cash, right? I mean, are they just again, buying Ferraris and they ran out of cash? Because that's a quick way to do it, right? That's not what's happening, right? They're running out of cash because they can't find a customer base and keep them, right? That's ultimately the problem. And then you have the extended nature of I spent too much money on my employees and all that stuff too. There is that. But at the end of the day, even that would be solved if you could get more clients in the door, higher volume, or because again, money only works two ways. You can make more or you can spend less. That's it. It's not go to the finance section at the bookstores that still exist and you'll see shelves and shelves. And it's look, there's two ways it works, And so I'm a big fan of the make more part, right? For people who aren't, again, just buying like their fifth Ferrari, and that's why they're failing, because that's not an issue. So they will tell you all the time, if you ask them, like finding clients, leads, clients, right? And I kind of distill that down the same way, that it's like, well, there's two things that you need to deal with clients. One is getting them, and the other is keeping them, right? And so there are some products or services. I don't want to be like too blanket here because I get very granular with who I talk about, but in general, you have products or services, right? And if you have services in general, what I always talk about is what you want to do is build an ecosystem around those services. Okay. And I always talk about people should never be able to graduate out of your ecosystem. So if you're truly serving your client to the best of your ability, you'll understand that if they do graduate out of something you provide to them, they hit another level then. And what can you do to serve them at that level? And sometimes people are specialized in a level, and that works great for them, and that's okay too. But for the most of us in this new business, era of professional services, this is how I built my business. Again, I started as design, and then I went into design and brand strategy. And then I basically became a full-blown design and marketing agency, right? Like we're literally there's no medium I don't work in now, right? Because they have those needs. I have to solve my clients' problems. And there's the common thorough line of like, well, we have to stay on brand and on message and on target. So I need Torrey's brain to be here because that's how it all flows through, the commonality, the thread of it all. So anyway, everybody's a little different. And maybe some of them have info products or something like that they're selling too, right? So that's a kind of a different thing. But at the end of the day, if somebody buys from you once, they've already bridged the trust gap. If you did a good job for them, there's no reason why they shouldn't come back to you. And so that I challenge founders all the time. Like if they're graduating from your ecosystem, what else could you add to your ecosystem to keep them inside of that? You can extend your value and expand your value there and make more money out of the same client by helping them level up, right? And then if you've got a high turnover rate otherwise, where it's like in perpetuity, like a design agency or marketing agency or, copywriting, coaching services, whatever, and they leave you, well, that's a problem, right? Because you weren't serving them. Like you should be able to serve them for, again, 11.2 years or more, right? Like why did they leave you, right? Because if you just kept them in your wheelhouse, you'd be fine, right? So there's customer acquisition and there's customer retention, right? Like those are the two things. So sometimes there's an acquisition problem. Sometimes there's both, whatever. If they can't keep the clients, that's a big red flag to me. Right off the bat, it's a big red flag because something's wrong, right? If they can't find the clients, that's different. Now we have a positioning problem. Now we have a problem with either understanding what you do, who you do it for, or why it matters, right? And that why it matters is the question that's the hardest, right? Because they don't know. They don't know why it matters to the client. And this is something that I'll try to address another part of your question here when it comes to like solopreneurs, okay? And for me, this is why it was so critical for me to position myself the way I position myself, because I knew I couldn't compete with the agencies directly on the dog and pony show. Like they're going to beat me every time, right? The thing that I had to make absolutely critically sure of is the need in the marketplace to get away from that, the frustration that the marketing directors felt about having to deal with the, smiley glad hand sales guy twice a freaking week, trying to invite them out to lunch and waste their time when their campaign isn't even done. You know what I mean? And it's like, how about you guys put your freaking effort into getting my deadlines met instead of constantly trying to sell me on the next work, right? Like this, I picked up on all these frustrations they had. And I was like, well, why don't I just make sure I solve all of that? But the real key for me was this, is that all of them had hit budget points where they're not that $1 million client, to the agency. They're more like a 200 or 300 or 400, which meant the agency punted them over to their B and C teams. And when they saw me, they knew that I was an A player at any of those agencies if I was working there. So they looked at it as I have direct access to him without all of the overhead. So that was a positioning thing for me, right? And I had to be really good, but I also have to fill their needs. I have to make sure I don't tell them, well, I don't do that, because then they couldn't physically hire me. So you have to figure out ways to kind of like solve the problem for your client and then speak directly to their problems and never make assumptions that they're actually happy with who they're serving right now. That's another thing I rail on all the freaking time. I talk about like, oh man, I could go on for hours about this. I'm sorry. I will wrap this up as soon as I can, this thought. But like this concept of market awareness, right? So if you're on Twitter, you might follow some of these people who talk about awareness levels. They've kind of popularized it. Well, these have been around since the 60s. Everybody in marketing knows them, okay? I talk about big brands like Coca-Cola, Nike, any of these like major brands, right? Well, they can afford the timeline to work people up those awareness ladders, right? From like, I've never heard of this before to like, I have to buy the newest one, right? They have that time. Small business does not have that time. We can't afford to go after people who are like, what? Why do I need you again? Like, that's a nightmare. Like, you can't talk to people who think that. And I go so far as to say, you can't talk to people who haven't done what you do before. Like if a marketing director is trying to hire me, right? I am I am infinitely more interested in the marketing director who's already worked with other design agencies or is currently working with a design agency than I am with somebody who's never hired one before. Because even if I land that marketing director, this is her first time doing it. Do you know how fun that is for me to have to also teach somebody and still try to make money, right? And like, it's great, but it's really hard to do, right? Versus somebody else who already has somebody and has already gotten experience doing it. But then I get the feedback or the pushback from people, well, that means they're taken. That means they're taken. So why would I talk to them? They already have somebody. I'm like, have you ever talked to anybody in business about their level of like frustration with their current service provider? Have you ever listened to them at a conference or association or a phone call rail on and on and on about how frustrating it is for them to work with their provider? Because I've heard it all the time. I'm like, all you have to do, you don't have to convince them of your value. You don't have to, show them how it works. You don't have to like give them these sheets that they show to their bosses so that they can convince them to work. All you have to do is cross one hurdle, and that is be better than the person they're working with now. It's like you condense all of this work and all these timelines into one singular objective, which is to show them why you're better than that person they're working with right now. They already value what you do. They already know how it works. That's so much easier to do. So I talk about this like, problem aware is where small business goes to die. These are people who know they have the problem, but have never, ever worked to find the solution or done anything about the solution. We can't afford to do that. And so that's an example for me of positioning yourself appropriately inside of a marketplace so that we can understand, like, it's not just about like, they need my service. It's about the mentality of the client that you're trying to serve as well when it comes to professional services. I would never, ever, ever serve the top 20 or the 20% of marketing directors who actually enjoy the dog and pony show of the agencies. I will never convince them. They love that. I hate it, right? The 80% who don't like that, who want their budgets to go as far as possible so they can look at their freaking boss during that monthly meeting and go, hey, we moved the needle. We made something happen. And he stays off of her back about it for another month. And she's like, God, I love this. That's what you're doing. And people do, I talk about this all the time in my own programs. And again, I won't go into it, but like, what people think is their competitive advantages, the cheaper, better, faster thing, right? Like I can either be cheaper, better, and or faster, right? And that's what people are always looking for, as if they completely overlook reliability, trustworthiness, brand association, like, how easy you are to talk to and communicate with, can I actually count on you to answer the phone on a Saturday when an emergency pops up, whatever, right? Like those are the things that are the acute frustrations of your clients. Those are the things they care about. Those are their real pain points. And so if you don't understand that, none of your marketing, none of your content is going to resonate with them because you never understood their pain. And then you also never understood, especially this, what it felt like for them to experience that pain. And I see this in marketing all the time. People speak directly to the pain point, the acute pain point, right? But they never talk about what it feels like to experience that pain point. And when I talk about what it feels like to experience that pain point, that person goes, they obviously get me. They can't know that if they didn't, right? Now you're talking positioning. Now you're getting there.
This has been such a rich conversation. And I know that we could keep going a whole nother hour. I'm grateful that you do have a program for all of this, so that for any of our listeners, for myself, even as growing a business, you're absolutely the man to connect with. And so for any of our listeners that are interested in what you're doing, what you're offering, or that just want to connect with you and follow along with your journey. Obviously, you're really active on X, but where's the best place for people to go?
Really X right now is at Torrey Dawley. I've got a major overhaul coming to all of my own marketing and things coming up in the fall here. And again, I just don't leverage it a lot. I leverage my interpersonal communication, with people. So, and that's Twitter's the best place to find that. If they're not in my community where I talk to them, all the time and every day, Twitter's the place where that's easy. Everything branches out from there. So we may as well start there.
Perfect. Yeah. And you got some real bangers on there on a very consistent basis. So you're definitely one of my favorite follows. Encourage all of our listeners. I'll have links in the show notes so that people can find you there. They can also find the site for the Perfect Positioning program. But dude, really rich interview. Really grateful for everything that you've shared. Tons of wisdom here. And look forward to staying in touch and continuing to learn more from you.
I really appreciate the opportunity, guys. This was fun, like really fun. I appreciate you both very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listeners, thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, connect to Torrey. Thanks all.